The first thing Travis felt was the taste of blood in his mouth, and the first thing he saw upon opening his eyes was his wife in an identical metal cage opposite him, with an identical gag soaked in blood in her mouth. It was a thick, coppery, nauseating taste. It filled everything, his tongue, his palate, his throat. It was everywhere, as if he had drunk a bucket of blood. He tried to swallow, to recoil, but couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. It was heavy and stiff. His head was splitting, his temples pounding in time with some internal, alarming rhythm. He forced himself to focus his vision. Semi-darkness. Cold, damp air smelling of mold, rust, and something else. Swedish and chemical. He was sitting on a concrete floor, his back against cold metal bars. He was inside a cage, a small one, about 2 by 2 meters, like a cage for a large wild animal. And directly opposite, 3 meters away, was a second identical cage. And in it, Lisa, his wife. She sat in the same position, her back arched, her eyes wide with horror staring right at him. Tears streamed from her wide, panic-distorted eyes, mingling with blood seeping from under the thick leather strap, biting into her face. A gag just like his, black, made of rough leather, with a metal buckle at the back, soaked in the same crimson, sticky substance that now flooded his mouth. He lunged forward, tried to scream her name, but only a muffled, suppressed groan escaped his throat. The gag pressed down on his tongue, pushed against his pharynx, triggering his gag reflex. All he could do was look at her. Look and feel an icy wave of horror washing over him, paralyzing his muscles more effectively than any chains. Lisa saw that he was conscious. In her eyes, besides the animal fear, something else flickered. Not hope, no, more like despair multiplied by 2. She shook her head wildly, trying to say something, to communicate something to him. But her sounds were also drowned by the gag. Travis looked around, trying to understand where they were. It looked like an abandoned industrial basement or bunker. High ceilings were lost in darkness. Walls of rough concrete. Everywhere, signs of decay. And silence. A tomb-like, oppressive silence, broken only by their ragged, hoarse breathing. And then he felt the cold metal on his neck. A heavy, tight-fitting collar. He reached for it with his hands. They weren't tied, and touched a smooth, cold surface. It felt like a collar. Wide, massive. He ran his fingers along the inside and gasped, snatching his hand back as if from fire. Sharp, long spikes were attached to the inside of the collar, their points aimed directly at his throat. Any sudden movement, any attempt to force it off, and the spikes would plunge into his neck. He looked at Lisa and saw the exact same device on her thin, fragile neck. A collar of death. His heart hammered, blood rushed to his head. He tried to stand again, grabbed the bars of the cage. They were solid and unyielding. The lock, massive, padlocked, hung on the outside. Suddenly, a click sounded in the basement and a light came on. A bright, blinding beam fell on the space between the cages. There on the concrete floor stood a small metal pedestal, and on it, a single object. A syringe injector with a transparent glass cartridge inside, which a bright yellow liquid sloshed. It looked crystal clear and sterile against the surrounding filth. And then, from hidden speakers somewhere in the darkness under the ceiling, a voice sounded. Synthesized, emotionless, devoid of any human intonation. The voice of a judge or an executioner. Travis. Travis flinched and pressed his back against the bars. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. You always believed in the poison of betrayal in your blood. The voice was quiet, but every word was uttered with frightening clarity, searing into his consciousness. Now it can be tested. Travis felt goosebumps run down his spine. The taste of blood in his mouth became even more distinct, even more disgusting. The gag in each of your mouths is soaked in a lethal nerve agent. In the cage opposite, Lisa let out a quiet, stifled wail. Her eyes filled with such horror that Travis felt physically sick. He himself felt an icy heat spreading through his body. Poison. They were already poisoned. Right now, this very second. But there is an antidote. Travis's gaze instinctively darted to the lone syringe on the pedestal, to that bright yellow liquid shining like liquid sun. 1. The word sounded like a sentence. 1, Just one dose. For 2 people. Inside the injector in the middle of the room. The cages will open in 1 minute. A loud mechanical click sounded somewhere in the silence, and a digital timer lit up on the wall between the cages, showing 60 seconds. The numbers began to relentlessly decrease. 58, 57. Decide which of you deserves it more. Travis looked at Lisa. She was looking at him, and there were no more tears in her eyes. There was only a question, the very question that had hung in their house for years but was never spoken aloud. The one you suspected? Memories flooded Travis like an avalanche. His endless interrogations, his screams, his humiliating searches of her phone, her things. His accusations thrown in her face after any delay, any smile at a stranger, any missed call. He saw betrayal in every glance, in every word. He had poisoned her with his jealousy, suffocated her with his suspicions, locked her in the invisible prison of his sick imagination. Or the one who suspected. Lisa was silent. She was always silent. She justified herself quietly, cried into her pillow, forgave him again and again. And he saw in her silence a confession, in her submission cunning, in her tears theater. Your jealousy was a prison for her.
45.
43. The voice fell silent. All that remained was the ticking of the timer, counting down the seconds to the beginning of the nightmare. Travis felt the first symptoms. Mild dizziness, tingling in his fingertips, weakness in his muscles. This wasn't just a bluff. This was poison. It was working. In the cage opposite, Lisa also shivered. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body shuddering with a spasm. Her eyes pleaded, but for what? To save her, or himself? He couldn't tell. He never could understand what she was really thinking. He yanked the bars of the cage with renewed force, but they didn't even budge. He tried to tear off the gag, but the buckle on the back was fastened tight, and any sharp movement caused the spikes of the collar to dig into the skin of his neck. Thoughts raced in a whirlwind. One antidote, one life, his or hers. Logic, cold and impartial, screamed at him, You must take it. You are stronger. You will survive. She is weak. She is already on the edge. It was his inner voice, the voice of survival, the one that always put his interests above all else. But there was another voice, a quiet, barely audible one, muffled by years of selfishness, a voice that whispered, You are guilty. You drove her to this. You created this hell. You deserve to die here. She deserves a chance. He looked at Lisa. She had stopped looking at him. She was looking at the syringe, and in her gaze there was no hope. There was resignation, the very same resignation that had driven him crazy all these years, as if she had already accepted her fate, as if she knew what choice he would make. 9. Suddenly Travis felt a cramp in his leg, sharp, painful. His breathing became labored, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his chest. From Lisa's side came a quiet, hoarse cough. The poison was doing its work. He had to decide. Now, who was he? A tyrant ready to kill his wife to save himself? Or the man he had never been? A redeemer? A martyr? 10. 9. The seconds melted away before his eyes. His mind was paralyzed by fear and poison. 6. 5. He saw their life. Not the one that was, but the one that could have been if he hadn't been a monster. Laughter, trust, love. Everything he had destroyed with his distrust. 3. Lisa closed her eyes. She waited, and Travis made a decision. A loud metallic clang echoed. The locks on both cages clicked and sprang open. The doors swung wide. Travis didn't remember how he got outside. Adrenaline, poison, animal terror, all mixed into one fiery cocktail. He rolled across the concrete floor, his body racked with convulsions, his vision blurring. He saw Lisa, weak and exhausted, crawl out of her cage and fall to her knees, breathing heavily. The syringe lay between them, the bright yellow light of life. They looked at each other, and in that look was everything. Their entire marriage. All the pain, all the fear. Travis screamed. He screamed through the gag, covered in blood and poison. It was a scream from his entire being, a scream of despair, remorse and hatred for himself. And he crawled. not towards the syringe. With his last strength, he crawled into a corner, away from the pedestal, pressed his back against the cold wall and closed his eyes. He couldn't watch this. He was giving her the chance. He was admitting his guilt. It was his only, his last, his most difficult act in life. He waited. Waited for the sound of footsteps. Waited for her to take the antidote and inject herself. Waited for her to survive. But the seconds passed and there was no sound. Only his own hoarse, ragged breathing. He opened his eyes. Lisa hadn't moved. She was sitting on the floor just a meter from the syringe and looking at him. Looking with that expression he could never decipher. There was no gratitude in her eyes, no hatred. There was understanding. Then she slowly, very slowly, shook her head and turned away from the injector. She did not take it. She refused her chance, refused her life. Travis couldn't believe his eyes. What was she doing? Why, was it revenge? Suicide? Or did she want to prove something to him? Something he could never understand? He tried to scream at her to take the syringe, to save herself, but his throat no longer obeyed. The poison had paralyzed his muscles. Darkness was gathering before his eyes. The last thing he saw was Lisa's gaze, calm, almost peaceful, and in it, that terrible truth he had been searching for all these years, and which now, in his death throes, he finally saw. She had never betrayed him. Never. Her only guilt was loving him, and his only guilt was being unable to believe in that love. And now they would die together, in these cages, with gags full of poison in their mouths, with spikes at their throats. He had lost. He had lost even before the cages opened, because his jealousy had indeed become a prison, and the door out of it now led only one way, to nowhere. The darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he felt was the bitter taste of blood and poison, and the realization that he never found out whose blood was on that gag, his or hers, or maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the poison of betrayal had always been only in him.